The Iron Wolves thought they'd found an easy target when they set their sights on Margaret Reynolds' quiet rural property. What they didn't know was that Margaret was a former Marine K9 trainer with 3 retired combat dogs. The moment they started their surveillance, they made the deadliest mistake of their lives. In seconds, these bikers would learn that age and silence are often the deadliest weapons. The morning sun cast long shadows across Margaret Reynolds' 40-acre property, painting the Oregon landscape in hues of gold and emerald. 3 German shepherds moved with practiced precision along the fence line, their movements betraying decades of military training that time could never truly erase. Major, the lead dog, maintained his position near the front porch, his steel-gray muzzle betraying years of service, but none of his combat-honed alertness. Gunner and Storm flanked the property's perimeter, their synchronized patrol demonstrating a level of coordination that spoke of something far beyond ordinary pet behavior. Margaret's weathered hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug, her eyes tracking her dog's movements. At 72, she moved with a deliberate grace that hinted at her Marine Corps background. The faded tattoo on her forearm, a K9 unit insignia, told a story of decades spent training the most elite military working dogs in some of the world's most challenging environments. Her current property, nestled in the rolling hills outside Salem, wasn't just a retirement home. It was a carefully maintained training ground, a sanctuary for veteran working dogs, and a testament to a lifetime of service. Every fence post, every hidden camera, every carefully placed defensive position told a story of strategic thinking honed through years of military experience. The sound of a distant motorcycle drew Major's attention. His ears pivoted precisely, tracking the sound long before it would have been audible to most humans. Margaret noted his posture, a subtle shift that spoke volumes to someone who had spent her entire career reading canine body language. "Easy, boy," she muttered, more out of habit than concern. These dogs weren't just pets. They were combat veterans with over 300 combined missions across Afghanistan, Iraq, and counter-narcotics operations in South America. Gunner approached, dropping a small device he'd retrieved from the fence line. Margaret examined the tiny object, a barely visible surveillance camera, professionally installed, but not quite professional enough to escape her dog's detection. "Well," she said quietly, "looks like someone's starting to get interested in us." The dogs remained alert but calm. Their training wasn't about aggression. It was about precise, calculated response. Years of military service had taught them that true protection wasn't about how loudly you could bark, but how effectively you could neutralize a threat before it became one. Margaret's mind drifted back to her last deployment, Afghanistan, 2011, a mountain pass near Kandahar, the mission that had earned Major his Silver Star, a rescue operation that saved an entire reconnaissance team when improvised explosive devices had decimated their initial approach. Most people saw an aging woman and her dogs. They didn't see the tactical minds that had survived some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. Her phone buzzed. Thomas Reyes, an old contact from her Marine Corps days. "Morning, Maggie." His voice carried the weight of years of law enforcement experience. "Heard you might be getting some unwanted attention." She watched Major track another distant vehicle, his posture never changing. "Seems someone's curious about the property." Thomas's chuckle was knowing. The Iron Wolves have been pushing into rural areas, protection rackets, drug distribution. They've been getting bolder. Margaret's expression hardened. She'd seen this pattern before. Insurgent tactics weren't limited to war zones. They followed the same psychological playbook, whether in Kandahar or the Oregon countryside. "They're mapping territories," she responded, more statement than question. "Testing responses, identifying vulnerabilities." "You're reading them exactly right," Thomas confirmed. "Local sheriff's department is spread thin. Budget cuts, staff shortages. These guys know how to exploit that." Major shifted, his movement drawing Margaret's attention. 3 vehicles had just passed by the property's outer fence line. Not stopping, not quite, just observing. "How much do you know about their current operations?" Margaret asked, her tactical mind already processing information. Thomas hesitated. "Enough to be concerned. They're not just a local motorcycle club anymore. They've got connections reaching into state-level infrastructure." Margaret watched as Gunner and Storm completed their perimeter check, rejoining Major with military precision. These dogs weren't just animals. They were a tactical unit that had survived some of the world's most challenging combat environments. "Keep me informed," she said finally. "And Thomas? Don't send anyone official just yet. Let them think we're just another quiet farm." As she ended the call, Margaret Reynolds understood something crucial. The Iron Wolves thought they were investigating a potential target. Instead, they'd just begun a reconnaissance of the most dangerous property they could have chosen. The dogs returned to her side. Major's tail gave a single, controlled wag. Not excitement, preparation. "They have no idea what's coming," Margaret murmured, scratching behind Major's ears. "Just like in Kandahar." The morning sun continued to rise over the Oregon landscape, another day beginning. But for Margaret Reynolds and her canine partners, a very different kind of mission was just beginning to take shape. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who look the most harmless. The first real attack came on a Tuesday, precisely calculated to catch the community off guard. Helen Carter's convenience store sat at the edge of town, a critical hub for the rural community. The morning started like any other, with dusty pickup trucks rolling in for coffee and locals exchanging morning pleasantries. Nobody noticed the first motorcycle until its shadow fell across the storefront, a dark predator moving with calculated silence. Jake Simmons, local deputy, was reviewing security footage later that afternoon when the pattern became clear. The Iron Wolves weren't just random troublemakers. They were systematic, methodical, calculating. First, they'd intimidate, then they'd escalate. The bike rolled slowly past Helen's store, its rider wearing the distinctive leather cut of the Iron Wolves. Black leather, faded patches, the kind of worn uniform that spoke of years of criminal experience. No sudden movements, no obvious threats, just presence, observation, the kind of tactical positioning Margaret would have recognized instantly from her military reconnaissance training. Helen's grandson Mike, home from college with 2 tours of Afghanistan under his belt, was stocking shelves when the bike made its first pass. His military history professor's words echoed in his mind. Psychological warfare isn't about violence. It's about creating an environment of constant uncertainty. Local veterans who gathered at the VFW hall began to notice subtle changes. Conversations grew more hushed. Eyes watched the windows more carefully. The bike's first pass was more than just a random movement. It was a calculated probe, a testing of local defenses. By noon, 3 more bikes had made similar passes. Always slow, always watching. Their movements mapped with mathematical precision, each pass revealing more about the community's response patterns. At the Peterson farm, old Jim found spray-painted marks on his barn's fence. Not gang tags, something more deliberate. Precise measurements, grid-like markings that suggested a systematic approach to territorial mapping. The markings told a story to someone with Margaret's training. These weren't random vandals. These were professionals conducting systematic reconnaissance. Each mark a data point, each pass a calculated intelligence-gathering mission. Margaret's phone rang. It was Helen, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They're watching," Helen said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Margaret's response was equally measured. "Tell me everything." Through the phone, Margaret could hear the subtle background sounds. A radio playing softly, the click of Helen preparing coffee, the professional calm of someone who refused to be intimidated. "2 bikes this morning," Helen continued, "different from the usual traffic. They're not just passing through, they're mapping." Margaret's tactical mind immediately began processing. Mapping, observation, psychological pressure. These weren't random acts. These were calculated probes designed to test local resilience, to identify weaknesses in community defenses. "Have you spoken with Jake?" Margaret asked. A pause. "He's tracking it, but the sheriff's department is stretched thin. Budget cuts mean 1 deputy covers 3 counties now. Classic insurgent tactics: exploit systemic weakness, create gaps in local defense infrastructure. The same methodology Margaret had seen in combat zones across the globe." Her mind flashed back to Kandahar, the same patient reconnaissance, the same methodical approach to identifying vulnerabilities. Insurgents who could wait weeks, months, to find the perfect moment of weakness. At the local diner, conversations grew more guarded. Two bikers walked in, not aggressive, just present, watching, listening. Their leather cuts bore the Iron Wolves logo, a stylized wolf's head with crossed motorcycle pistons behind it, a symbol of territorial dominance. Jake Simmons sat in the corner, notepad out, professional, calculating, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew something was brewing. "We need more than just observation," Jake told Margaret during a quiet phone call. "But we need proof, something concrete." Margaret understood precisely. Evidence, documentation. The military had taught her that intelligence was the most powerful weapon. Gunner approached, dropping another small device he'd found near the property line. A sophisticated tracking beacon. Not cheap, not amateur. Military-grade equipment repurposed for criminals' surveillance. "They're testing more than just our nerve," Margaret muttered, examining the device. The beacon was a marvel of compact technology, expensive, precise, designed for long-term surveillance. Someone was investing serious resources into understanding the area's defensive capabilities. Local veterans began to network. Mike Peterson's military connections started sharing information. Whispers of increased activity, unusual movements, coordinated reconnaissance that suggested something far more significant was brewing. At the county library, an old map of local properties appeared mysteriously spread out. Subtle markings, carefully placed pins. Someone was building a comprehensive understanding of the local terrain, identifying potential strategic points of interest. By midnight, Margaret had mapped out the surveillance patterns. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local motorcycle gang. They were operating with a level of tactical sophistication that suggested deeper connections. Military training, professional-grade equipment, systematic psychological pressure. This wasn't just about intimidation. This was preparation for something much larger. Major, Gunner, and Storm maintained their nighttime patrol. Three combat veterans who had faced far more dangerous opponents in far more challenging environments. The night settled over the Oregon landscape. Cool, calculated, waiting. A single motorcycle's headlight traced a distant road. Watching, probing, testing. Margaret Reynolds stood at her window, Major pressed against her leg. Not a guard dog, a tactical partner. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one patient enough to watch and wait. And sometimes the watchers don't realize they're the ones being studied. The war room wasn't a military bunker. It was Margaret Reynolds' kitchen. Spread across her worn oak table, a collection of maps, photographs, and meticulously annotated documents told a story far more complex than a simple local crime problem. Major, Gunner, and Storm moved between stacks of intelligence. Their movements as deliberate as any tactical team clearing a combat zone. Mike Peterson arrived at dawn, a manila folder tucked under his arm. Fresh out of military intelligence training, he carried the precise movements of someone who understood the value of information. "They're more organized than we thought," Mike said, spreading satellite images across the table. Margaret's fingers traced the contours of the photographs, motorcycle routes, property boundaries, communication patterns. Each image was a piece of a larger puzzle. Her military contacts had been working overtime. Thomas Reyes, her old Marine Corps intelligence liaison, had been making quiet inquiries. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local problem. They were part of a larger infrastructure that stretched across 3 counties. The local library had become an unexpected resource. Old county records, property maps, historical land transactions. Each document offered another piece of the complex puzzle. "Watch the patterns," Margaret murmured to Mike, her finger moving across a series of surveillance photos. The images showed more than just motorcycle movements. They revealed a systematic approach to territorial expansion. Precise, calculated, the kind of methodical reconnaissance Margaret had seen in the most dangerous combat zones. Gunner approached, dropping a small electronic device he'd retrieved from near the property line. A tracking beacon, sophisticated, military grade. "Someone's investing serious resources," Mike observed, examining the device. Margaret's mind was already processing. Resource allocation, communication networks, tactical positioning. The Iron Wolves were operating with a level of sophistication that suggested deeper connections. Local veterans began contributing pieces of information. Whispered conversations at the VFW hall, subtle observations. Each snippet added depth to their growing intelligence profile. Her secure phone buzzed. Thomas Reyes. "You're going to want to see this." His voice carried the weight of years of intelligence work. A series of encrypted files began downloading. Bank records, property transactions, communication logs. The kind of intelligence that took months, sometimes years to compile. "They're not just a motorcycle gang," Thomas explained. "They're infrastructure, a network disguised as a criminal organization." The kitchen transformed into a tactical analysis center. Mike began mapping communication patterns. Margaret cross-referenced property records. The dogs moved between them, alert, watching, processing. Small details emerged. Property purchases along strategic routes, communication patterns that suggested coordination far beyond a local criminal enterprise. Shell companies, carefully disguised financial transactions. Local law enforcement had missed the larger picture. Budget cuts, understaffing, limited resources. The perfect environment for a sophisticated criminal network to operate. "They're building something," Margaret said quietly. Mike looked up. "Building what?" A complex web of connections began to take shape. The Iron Wolves weren't just moving drugs or running protection rackets. They were establishing a comprehensive infrastructure, transportation routes, communication networks, strategic property acquisitions. "This goes deeper than local law enforcement," Thomas's voice continued through the secure line. "We're looking at a systematic territorial expansion." Margaret studied the maps, the routes, the property lines. Each piece told a story of calculated movement. 3 counties, carefully selected properties, strategic positioning. "They're creating corridors," she muttered. Mike looked up, understanding dawning in his eyes. Transportation routes, not just for illegal goods, but for complete territorial control. The dogs remained alert. Major's ears would twitch at the slightest sound. Gunner and Storm maintained their tactical positioning, watching the room's perimeter. Military working dogs understood something crucial. Intelligence wasn't just about information. It was about context, pattern recognition, threat assessment. By midday, a comprehensive picture emerged. The Iron Wolves weren't a random criminal group. They were a sophisticated operation with connections that reached far beyond local law enforcement's capabilities. Old county records revealed a pattern of strategic land acquisitions, property transfers through shell companies, carefully disguised financial transactions that would challenge even experienced forensic accountants. "We need a strategy," Mike said, spreading the documents across the table. Margaret's mind was already working. Years of military intelligence training kicked in. Systematic approach, identify vulnerabilities, create a comprehensive response. "We don't just gather intelligence," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of tactical experience. "We use it." The dogs moved closer, not just animals, tactical partners who had survived some of the world's most challenging environments. Outside, a motorcycle's distant rumble suggested the Iron Wolves were still watching, still probing, but now they were the ones being studied. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's information. The old military training facility on the edge of the county had seen better days. Abandoned for years, its concrete buildings and overgrown training grounds now served a new purpose. Margaret Reynolds moved with calculated precision, transforming the forgotten space into a strategic command center. Major, Gunner, and Storm worked alongside her, their movements as deliberate as any military tactical team. Mike Peterson arrived with a truck full of equipment, not standard law enforcement gear, specialized tactical systems salvaged from military surplus, modified for their specific needs. "We're going to turn their tactics against them," Margaret explained, spreading detailed maps across a reinforced table. The maps told a story of calculated vulnerability, the Iron Wolves' communication routes, property acquisitions, movement patterns. Each line, each notation represented months of careful intelligence gathering. Local veterans began arriving. Not a random group, carefully selected. Each brought unique skills, communication experts, former military intelligence, tactical specialists who understood the value of precision. Thomas Reyes arrived with a stack of encrypted files. Former Marine Corps intelligence, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated some of the world's most complex operational environments. They're more sophisticated than we initially thought, Thomas said, spreading digital surveillance reports across the table. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local motorcycle gang. They were a sophisticated criminal infrastructure disguised as a motorcycle club, transportation networks, property acquisition strategies, communication protocols that would challenge most law enforcement agencies. Margaret's tactical training kicked in. Systematic approach, identify vulnerabilities, create a comprehensive response. We're not just defending, she told the assembled team. We're going to dismantle their entire operation. The dogs moved between team members, their presence a constant reminder of the tactical expertise in the room. Major's ears would twitch at the slightest sound. Gunner and Storm maintained perimeter awareness, their military training evident in every calculated movement. Mike began setting up communication intercept equipment, sophisticated systems that could track and analyze digital and radio communications, not just monitoring, understanding patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. They've been careful, Mike explained, configuring complex signal analysis software. But no communication system is completely secure. Local law enforcement contacts provided additional intelligence. Budget cuts had created blind spots. The Iron Wolves had exploited these gaps with surgical precision. Thomas brought out specialized mapping software, satellite imagery, communication route analysis, property transaction records. A comprehensive picture began to emerge. They're creating a corridor, Margaret observed, tracing potential routes on the map, not just for illegal goods, for complete territorial control. Training began in earnest, not traditional law enforcement preparation, something more sophisticated, a comprehensive tactical response system that blended military precision with local community knowledge. Communication protocols, tactical positioning, response strategies. Former military personnel trained local volunteers, not about confrontation, about strategic resistance, understanding how to identify threats, how to respond without escalation. The dogs underwent specialized retraining, not just protection, advanced tactical response, communication interception, threat detection beyond standard K9 capabilities. Major demonstrated advanced signal detection techniques. A simple hand signal could redirect the dog's entire tactical approach. Years of military training transformed into a complex communication system. Gunner showed remarkable aptitude for electronic surveillance detection, able to identify hidden tracking devices with a precision that would challenge most specialized equipment. Storm specialized in perimeter security, movement tracking, threat assessment, the kind of skills developed through years of military operational experience. Communication networks took shape, not just radio systems, a comprehensive information-sharing platform that could rapidly distribute intelligence across the community. We're creating more than a defense, Margaret explained to the assembled team. We're building a comprehensive threat response system. Local businesses began receiving specialized training, how to identify suspicious activities, how to gather intelligence without direct confrontation. Technology played a crucial role. Specialized software tracked the communication patterns, identified potential threat vectors, created a comprehensive intelligence gathering system that operated with military precision. Mike developed a custom communication encryption system, not just about securing messages, about creating a communication network that could rapidly respond to emerging threats. Thomas brought in contacts from federal law enforcement, quiet support, not direct intervention, but additional intelligence resources that could provide critical insights. The abandoned training facility transformed, no longer just a meeting place, a nerve center of tactical preparation. Maps covered walls, communication systems hummed with encrypted data. Dogs moved through the space, their tactical training evident in every calculated movement. We're not just preparing for a confrontation, Margaret told the team during a strategy session. We're creating a comprehensive system of community defense. Outside, the Oregon landscape remained quiet, but something was changing. A community was transforming from potential victims to strategic defenders. The Iron Wolves thought they were hunting. They didn't realize they were about to become the hunted. Preparation was everything, and Margaret Reynolds was a master of preparation. The first true test of their defensive strategy arrived with the precision of a military operation. Dawn broke over the Oregon landscape, transforming the Peterson farm into a tactical command center that would have impressed the most seasoned military strategists. Margaret Reynolds stood at the center of a carefully prepared defensive position, her three German shepherds, Major, Gunner, and Storm, positioned with the calculated precision of a special operations team. The preparation had been months in the making. Every fence line, every approach vector, every potential point of vulnerability had been meticulously analyzed, mapped, and fortified. Mike Peterson moved between banks of sophisticated surveillance equipment, his movements betraying years of military intelligence training. Banks of monitors displayed thermal imaging, communication intercepts, and real-time geographical mapping that would make most law enforcement agencies envious. First movement detected, Mike's voice was clinical, professional, a statement of fact rather than a warning. The first motorcycle appeared on the eastern approach, its engine a low rumble that cut through the morning's crisp silence. This wasn't a random pass. This was a calculated reconnaissance mission. Thomas Reyes, Margaret's longtime intelligence contact, had spent weeks dissecting the Iron Wolves' communication patterns. They were far more than a local motorcycle gang. They were a sophisticated criminal infrastructure with connections that stretched across multiple counties, potentially crossing state lines and international boundaries. Margaret's hand moved with subtle precision, a signal that would be invisible to an untrained eye but spoke volumes to her canine partners. Major's response was instantaneous, not an aggressive posture, but a tactical repositioning that demonstrated years of combat training. The motorcycle rider moved with a precision that screamed professional training, ex-military most likely, special forces or military intelligence now working for a criminal enterprise. Each movement calculated, each pass a careful probe of defensive capabilities. Multiple approach vectors identified, Mike reported, his fingers dancing across communication interfaces that looked more like a NASA control center than a rural farm command post. Thermal imaging shows two additional vehicles converging from different angles. Classic tactical approach, multiple entry points, testing response times, identifying potential weaknesses in their defensive infrastructure. The preparation had been comprehensive, not just physical preparations, but a multi-layered strategy of psychological warfare and intelligence gathering that went far beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. Local farmers had been carefully briefed, not about direct confrontation, but about observation and documentation. They had become an invisible network of intelligence gatherers, creating a comprehensive surveillance system that could track movement without direct engagement. Gunner moved silently, positioning himself to intercept potential electronic surveillance. Another hand signal from Margaret activated the first layer of their defensive strategy, a complex system of electronic countermeasures and tactical positioning that would challenge even the most sophisticated criminal reconnaissance team. The motorcycle completed its first pass. No sudden movements, no obvious threats. But Margaret understood the tactical language of reconnaissance. This was a probe, a test of their defensive capabilities. Electromagnetic signatures suggest advanced communication equipment, Mike reported, analyzing the streaming data. They're not just watching, they're gathering intelligence. The dogs weren't simply observing, they were analyzing, processing. Each movement, a calculated assessment of potential threat vectors. Thomas's encrypted files told a deeper story. The Iron Wolves were building a systematic infrastructure, transportation corridors, communication networks, strategic property acquisitions. Their goal wasn't simple criminal enterprise, it was complete territorial control. The motorcycle made a second pass. Closer to the property line this time, Margaret's hand moved again. Another signal, invisible, precise. Gunner shifted position. Electronic countermeasures activated, not to block, to analyze, to document. Local law enforcement contacts had provided critical intelligence. Budget cuts had created systematic vulnerabilities. The Iron Wolves had exploited these gaps with surgical precision. By mid-morning, 3 separate motorcycle passes had been documented. Precise, calculated, each movement revealing more about their tactical approach than any direct confrontation. "They're probing our response times," Thomas observed through the secure communication channel, "testing our defensive capabilities." Margaret's response was calm, calculated. "Let them continue." The dogs remained in perfect tactical positioning. Major, Gunner, Storm, each understanding their role in a complex defensive strategy that went far beyond traditional protection. Mike's communication systems intercepted and analyzed multiple communication channels, radio frequencies, encrypted digital communications. Each piece of data, another thread in their comprehensive intelligence tapestry. The motorcycle riders had no idea they were feeding the defenders exactly the intelligence they needed. By early afternoon, the pattern became crystal clear. The Iron Wolves were conducting a systematic reconnaissance, not just physical observation. They were mapping communication networks, defensive capabilities, response times, but they had no idea they were the ones being studied. Margaret watched the thermal imaging displays, tracked the motorcycle movements, analyzed their approach vectors with the same precision she once used in combat zones across the globe. This wasn't about intimidation. This was about understanding, analyzing, preparing. The Iron Wolves thought they were hunting. They didn't realize they were walking into a carefully prepared tactical trap. Outside, another motorcycle appeared on the distant horizon. The first real test was about to begin, and Margaret Reynolds was prepared to show them exactly why you never underestimate a veteran, her dogs, or a community ready to defend itself. The line between hunter and hunted was about to blur. The moment of true engagement arrived with the precision of a military strike. Midnight approached, painting the Oregon landscape in shades of deep blue and shadow. Margaret Reynolds watched through reinforced windows, Major, Gunner, and Storm positioned with tactical precision around the command center. The first indication came not from visual surveillance, but from a subtle change in the dog's behavior. Major's ears shifted, Gunner's body tensed, Storm's eyes locked onto a distant point beyond human perception. "Incoming," Mike Peterson's voice cut through the command center's controlled silence. Thermal imaging revealed multiple heat signatures approaching from 3 different vectors. Not a random assault, a coordinated tactical operation. Thomas Rias' voice crackled through the encrypted communication channel. "They're bringing serious hardware this time." Motorcycle engines broke the night silence. Not the probing reconnaissance of previous encounters. This was a full-scale assault. Margaret's hand moved, a single precise signal that transformed the entire defensive strategy from observation to active response. The dogs moved like liquid shadows, not guard dogs, tactical operators with years of combat experience encoded into every calculated movement. "Multiple vehicles approaching," Mike reported, his fingers dancing across sophisticated communication interfaces. "Looks like 12 motorcycles, 3 support vehicles." The Iron Wolves had committed everything to this assault. No more reconnaissance, no more testing, a full-scale attack designed to break their defensive capabilities. But they didn't understand who they were attacking. Gunner took point on electronic countermeasures, advanced systems designed to intercept, analyze, and disrupt enemy communications. Not just blocking, understanding, exploiting. Storm moved to perimeter defense, his movements a perfect demonstration of military working dog tactical training. Each step calculated, each position chosen with surgical precision. Major remained closest to Margaret, but his awareness extended far beyond the immediate command center. "They're using military-grade communication protocols," Mike observed, analyzing the incoming signal patterns. "Ex-military personnel in their ranks." Thomas's encrypted files had warned them. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local criminal enterprise. They were a sophisticated operation with connections that reached deep into military and law enforcement infrastructures. The first wave of motorcycles breached the outer perimeter. Not a random charge, a calculated assault designed to test defensive capabilities. Margaret's hand moved again. Another signal, invisible to the untrained eye, but speaking volumes to her canine partners. Electronic countermeasures activated, not to block, to analyze, to document, to turn the assault into an intelligence-gathering operation. Local farmers, briefed, prepared, integrated into the defensive network, began reporting additional movement, not panic, precise, controlled observations that fed into their comprehensive intelligence system. They're pushing from multiple angles, Mike reported, attempting to overwhelm our defensive positioning. Classic military assault strategy, multiple approach vectors, designed to identify and exploit potential weaknesses. But Margaret Reynolds had spent decades preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. The motorcycles hit their first defensive barrier, not a physical obstacle, a complex system of electronic and tactical responses designed to confuse, divert, and analyze. Gunners' advanced electronic warfare capabilities began to shine, intercepting communication channels, analyzing tactical frequencies, turning the attacker's own technologies against them. Storm moved with a precision that would challenge the most sophisticated tactical teams, not just defending, actively controlling the engagement space. Major remained the strategic coordinator. Years of combat experience compressed into every calculated movement. They're bringing additional resources, Thomas warned through the secure channel. Heavy equipment, not just motorcycles. The thermal imaging revealed the full scale of the assault. 12 motorcycles, 3 support vehicles, potentially armed personnel. But Margaret had transformed the Peterson farm into more than just a defensive position. It was a comprehensive tactical response system. Local veterans, carefully integrated into the defensive network, began implementing carefully prepared response protocols, not vigilantes, a coordinated, intelligent defensive force. The first wave of motorcycles found themselves facing something entirely unexpected. Not a simple property defense, a comprehensive tactical response that anticipated their every move. Electronic systems intercepted and analyzed communication frequencies. Tactical positioning confused their approach vectors. The dogs moved with a level of coordination that would challenge most professional military units. They're losing tactical cohesion, Mike reported, watching the tactical displays. Our defensive response is breaking their assault strategy. The Iron Wolves had committed everything to this attack, believing they would overwhelm a simple rural property. They didn't realize they were walking into a carefully prepared tactical trap. The night erupted in a controlled chaos of tactical responses. Not violence. Precise, calculated defensive maneuvers designed to neutralize the threat while gathering critical intelligence. Margaret Reynolds watched the tactical displays, analyzed the approach vectors, coordinated the defensive response. The line between hunter and hunted had never been more blurred, and the Iron Wolves were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating a veteran, her dogs, and a community prepared to defend itself. The first real battle was about to begin. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed a complexity that defied conventional understanding of local criminal operations. Daylight spread across the Oregon landscape, transforming the Peterson farm into a scene of meticulous tactical deconstruction. Federal investigators moved with calculated precision, each step revealing layers of a criminal infrastructure far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. Margaret Reynolds stood at the command center, her 3 German shepherds, Major, Gunner, and Storm, positioned with the same tactical awareness they'd demonstrated throughout the engagement. The dogs weren't just witnesses, they were critical intelligence assets that had fundamentally altered the course of the investigation. Thomas Harasses moved between evidence teams, his decades of intelligence experience evident in every calculated movement. Years of military and federal service had prepared him for complex investigations, but this operation was something entirely different. We're looking at a multi-layered criminal enterprise, Thomas explained to the assembled federal investigators, spreading digital files across a secure tactical display. This isn't just a local motorcycle gang. This is a sophisticated criminal infrastructure with connections that extend far beyond rural Oregon. Mike Peterson analyzed communication intercepts, his fingers moving with the precision of a seasoned intelligence analyst. Years of military intelligence training had prepared him for complex data analysis. But the depth of the Iron Wolves operation was challenging even his extensive experience. The dogs worked alongside federal evidence teams, their advanced training transforming them from combat dogs to critical intelligence gatherers. Gunner demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify hidden communication devices, while Storm's perimeter tracking revealed evidence locations that initial sweep teams had overlooked. Layers of the Iron Wolves infrastructure began to unravel with surgical precision. Shell companies revealed intricate financial networks. Property transactions mapped out a systematic territorial expansion strategy. Communication logs exposed a web of connections that reached into local law enforcement, political structures, and potentially federal agencies. This goes beyond traditional criminal enterprise, the lead FBI investigator observed, studying the comprehensive intelligence gathered. We're looking at a near-perfect example of institutional infiltration. Margaret watched the tactical displays, each screen revealing another layer of the criminal network's complexity. This wasn't just about taking down a motorcycle gang. This was about exposing a systematic infrastructure of corruption and criminal activity. Local law enforcement officials who had been compromised began to be identified. Some voluntarily came forward. Others were exposed through meticulous digital forensics and communication intercepts. The dogs moved through the scene with a precision that challenged traditional investigative methods. Major's ability to detect subtle changes in human behavior complemented the digital forensics. Gunner's electronic warfare training allowed him to identify communication patterns that human investigators might miss. Your K9 team has provided more actionable intelligence than 6 months of traditional investigation, the federal prosecutor remarked, reviewing the mounting evidence. Mike continued his deep dive into the intercepted data. "Look at this," he called out, highlighting a series of encrypted communication logs. "These aren't just local communication channels. We're seeing connections to international criminal networks." Property records told a story of systematic territorial acquisition, not random purchases, but a calculated strategy of infrastructure development. The Iron Wolves had been building something far more significant than a simple criminal enterprise. Thomas examined financial transaction records, his experienced eye catching subtle patterns of money laundering and institutional corruption. "They've been playing a long game," he muttered. Years of careful positioning. Federal agencies began mobilizing. Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, state-level investigative units, each agency discovering pieces of a much larger puzzle. The motorcycle gang had thought they were conducting a simple territorial assault. They didn't realize they were walking into a comprehensive intelligence operation that would expose their entire criminal infrastructure. Margaret's tactical preparation had transformed a potential crime scene into a strategic intelligence gathering operation. Every piece of evidence became a critical component of a larger investigation. Arrest warrants began to be executed across multiple counties. Communication networks collapsed. The carefully built criminal infrastructure began to crumble under the weight of comprehensive evidence. "We're looking at potential federal racketeering charges," the lead prosecutor explained, reviewing the mounting documentation. "This goes far beyond local criminal activity. We're talking about a systematic criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple levels of local and potentially state infrastructure." The dogs continued to work, their tactical training allowing them to identify evidence and behavioral patterns that challenged traditional investigative methods. Major's ability to detect subtle changes in human behavior. Gunner's electronic warfare capabilities. Storm's advanced tracking skills. Local community members who had been intimidated for years began to come forward. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak now found their voices, supported by the comprehensive evidence gathered. But Margaret understood this was about more than just taking down a criminal enterprise. This was about exposing systemic vulnerabilities, about showing how a prepared community could stand against organized criminal infrastructure. As the investigation continued, the true depth of the Iron Wolves operation became clear. They hadn't just been a local criminal group. They had been building a sophisticated infrastructure of territorial control, institutional corruption, and criminal enterprise. The federal task force continued to unravel the complex network. Each piece of evidence revealed another layer of their sophisticated operation: communication channels, financial transactions, property acquisitions. "This is going to change how we approach local criminal investigations," the lead FBI investigator told Margaret, studying the comprehensive intelligence they had gathered. As daylight continued to reveal the complexity of their operation, The Iron Wolves' leadership realized the true extent of their miscalculation. They had thought they were hunting. They didn't realize they had become the hunted. The first real battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The aftermath of the confrontation revealed a complexity that defied conventional understanding of local criminal operations. Daylight spread across the Oregon landscape, transforming the Peterson farm into a scene of meticulous, tactical deconstruction. Federal investigators moved with calculated precision, each step revealing layers of a criminal infrastructure far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. Margaret Reynolds stood at the command center, her three German shepherds, Major, Gunner, and Storm, positioned with the same tactical awareness they demonstrated throughout the engagement. The dogs weren't just witnesses, they were critical intelligence assets that had fundamentally altered the course of the investigation. Thomas Reyes moved between evidence teams, his decades of intelligence experience evident in every calculated movement. Years of military and federal service had prepared him for complex investigations. But this operation was something entirely different. "We're looking at a multi-layered criminal enterprise," Thomas explained to the assembled federal investigators, spreading digital files across a secure tactical display. "This isn't just a local motorcycle gang. This is a sophisticated criminal infrastructure with connections that extend far beyond rural Oregon." Mike Peterson analyzed communication intercepts, his fingers moving with the precision of a seasoned intelligence analyst. Years of military intelligence training had prepared him for complex data analysis, but the depth of the Iron Wolves operation was challenging even his extensive experience. The dogs worked alongside federal evidence teams, their advanced training transforming them from combat dogs to critical intelligence gatherers. Gunner demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify hidden communication devices, while Storm's perimeter tracking revealed evidence locations that initial sweep teams had overlooked. Layers of the Iron Wolves infrastructure began to unravel with surgical precision. Shell companies revealed intricate financial networks. Property transactions mapped out a systematic territorial expansion strategy. Communication logs exposed a web of connections that reached into local law enforcement, political structures, and potentially federal agencies. "This goes beyond traditional criminal enterprise," the lead FBI investigator observed, studying the comprehensive intelligence gathered. "We're looking at a near-perfect example of institutional infiltration." Margaret watched the tactical displays, each screen revealing another layer of the criminal network's complexity. This wasn't just about taking down a motorcycle gang. This was about exposing a systematic infrastructure of corruption and criminal activity. Local law enforcement officials who had been compromised began to be identified. Some voluntarily came forward. Others were exposed through meticulous digital forensics and communication intercepts. The dogs moved through the scene with a precision that challenged traditional investigative methods. Major's ability to detect subtle changes in human behavior complemented the digital forensics. Gunner's electronic warfare training allowed him to identify communication patterns that human investigators might miss. "Your K9 team has provided more actionable intelligence than 6 months of traditional investigation," the federal prosecutor remarked, reviewing the mounting evidence. Mike continued his deep dive into the intercepted data. "Look at this," he called out, highlighting a series of encrypted communication logs. "These aren't just local communication channels. We're seeing connections to international criminal networks." Property records told a story of systematic territorial acquisition. Not random purchases, but a calculated strategy of infrastructure development. The Iron Wolves had been building something far more significant than a simple criminal enterprise. Thomas examined financial transaction records, his experienced eye catching subtle patterns of money laundering and institutional corruption. "They've been playing a long game," he muttered. "Years of careful positioning." Federal agencies began mobilizing: Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, state-level investigative units, each agency discovering pieces of a much larger puzzle. The motorcycle gang had thought they were conducting a simple territorial assault. They didn't realize they were walking into a comprehensive intelligence operation that would expose their entire criminal infrastructure. Margaret's tactical preparation had transformed a potential crime scene into a strategic intelligence gathering operation. Every piece of evidence became a critical component of a larger investigation. Arrest warrants began to be executed across multiple counties. Communication networks collapsed. The carefully built criminal infrastructure began to crumble under the weight of comprehensive evidence. "We're looking at potential federal racketeering charges," the lead prosecutor explained, reviewing the mounting documentation. "This goes far beyond local criminal activity. We're talking about a systematic criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple levels of local and potentially state infrastructure." The dogs continued to work, their tactical training allowing them to identify evidence and behavioral patterns that challenge traditional investigative methods. Major's ability to detect subtle changes in human behavior, Gunner's electronic warfare capabilities, Storm's advanced tracking skills. Local community members who had been intimidated for years began to come forward. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak now found their voices, supported by the comprehensive evidence gathered. But Margaret understood this was about more than just taking down a criminal enterprise. This was about exposing systemic vulnerabilities, about showing how a prepared community could stand against organized criminal infrastructure. As the investigation continued, the true depth of the Iron Wolves operation became clear. They hadn't just been a local criminal group. They had been building a sophisticated infrastructure of territorial control, institutional corruption, and criminal enterprise. The federal task force continued to unravel the complex network. Each piece of evidence revealed another layer of their sophisticated operation: communication channels, financial transactions, property acquisitions. "This is going to change how we approach local criminal investigations," the lead FBI investigator told Margaret, studying the comprehensive intelligence they had gathered. As daylight continued to reveal the complexity of their operation, the Iron Wolves leadership realized the true extent of their miscalculation. They had thought they were hunting. They didn't realize they had become the hunted. The first real battle was over, but the war was just beginning.